Story 1. The markers around camp. I spend 1 week every October testing lightweight winter camping gear before guiding season starts. I've done that for years. It started as a useful habit. Then it turned into a kind of personal checkpoint, I guess. Make sure the stove still works in cold, damp weather. Make sure the sleep system holds heat. Make sure my joints still do what I tell them to do when the days get shorter and the ground gets slick. That last part was the real reason, if I'm being honest. I've spent most of my adult life outside, not in the weekend warrior way, not in the internet gear review way, I mean actually outside. Search calls, rescue volunteer work, guiding, hauling people in stupid amounts of gear up and down steep ground in weather that makes your fingers stop listening to you. I stopped being impressed by mountain stories a long time ago. People hear one sound in the dark or catch one shape at the edge of a tree line and suddenly the whole ridge is haunted. Most of the time it's wind, bad sleep, or somebody who wasn't as prepared as they thought they were. That was more or less my attitude going into this trip, maybe more stubborn than usual. I had knee surgery the year before and technically it went fine. Everybody said that word, fine, which is a word doctors use when they don't have to carry your pack for you. The repair held. Physical therapy worked. I could hike again. I could kneel if I didn't stay there too long. I could manage stairs without thinking about it every single time. But I couldn't go back to rescue work. Too much instability under heavy lateral load. Too much risk if I had to move fast on uneven ground with someone else's life hanging off me. Once people hear that, they start doing that careful voice around you. They say things like, "You sure you want to take that route?" or "Hey, no rush, I can carry that." I hate that voice. So I picked a route that was harder than it needed to be. Not dramatically harder, just enough to prove a point to nobody except me. Wet leaves, old ruts, a long approach, some elevation changes my physical therapist would have called unnecessary. Somewhere along the Kentucky side of the Appalachians, and that's as specific as I'm willing to get. If you know the region, you know there are 100 places that look exactly like the one I'm talking about anyway. A decommissioned fire road branching off a ridge trail, ending near what used to be a logging turnaround before time and weather half took it back. There was an old hunting lean-to there too, or the remains of one. 3 walls, slumped roof, rhododendron creeping in around the edges like it was trying to eat it. I told myself the trip was practical, gear testing, route conditioning. But the truth underneath it was uglier and simpler. I needed to know whether I was still capable out there or if everybody had quietly become right about me. That's what had me driving before dawn with a truck full of lightweight winter gear, freeze-dried meals, trail cameras, a new satellite beacon clipped to my chest strap, and a knee brace I kept pretending I only packed out of habit. I stopped at a bait shop near the highway for coffee that tasted like burned pennies and a bag of ice I didn't really need. Little place with fluorescent lights too white for that hour. Minnow tanks humming in the corner, one old calendar on the wall turned to the wrong month. The woman behind the counter looked at the camping stuff in my cart and asked if I was headed past the old turnaround. I said, yeah, probably camping near there for the night. She just said, "Oh," not dramatic, not ominous, just "oh." Then she rang me up and slid me my receipt like she'd already moved on in her head. At the time, it barely registered. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sky had that washed-out late October look where everything seems thinner than it should. I did my usual routine, check pack straps, check beacon, check sidearm, check headlamp batteries, stretch the knee, listen for the boot insoles. They had that damp little squeak every time I shifted weight, which would have driven a less patient person insane by mid-afternoon. I had a crushed cherry-flavored electrolyte packet stuck inside my jacket pocket from some earlier trip, and every time I shoved my hand in there I could feel the powdery lump through the fabric. Stuff like that stays with me more than it probably should. Near the start of the path, I noticed orange tape tied low around a few saplings, lower than I would have expected. Around shin or knee height, not eye level. Fresh looking. I figured hunters had marked a route recently, or somebody had done some informal property line nonsense. It wasn't unusual enough to stop for. In those mountains you see tape, old ribbon, bits of survey string, all kinds of leftovers from people trying to tell the woods what belongs to them. I crossed the first creek and lost cell service exactly where I'd expected to. After that, it was just the wet leaf cover over old tire ruts, the occasional exposed stone, and that quiet you only get once you're far enough from a road that engines stop feeling possible. Nearest gas station was over 40 minutes away by truck. On foot, if something went bad, it would have felt like another planet. I made decent time. The knee complained on the steeper stretch, but held. That's the thing about pain after surgery. It doesn't always mean damage. Sometimes it's just your body reminding you it remembers. I reached the lean-to before dark, dropped my pack, and took a minute to look around the site the way I always do. Fire ring full of old ash and leaves. One back corner of the lean-to sagging. Ground packed harder under the roof than out around it. Damp canvas smell mixed with wood rot and cold mineral creek air drifting up from below. Fine grit from the road kept finding its way into my mouth every time the wind shifted, rubbing between my molars like I was chewing sand. It actually felt good to be there. That's the part I keep coming back to. Before it got weird, it felt good. I boiled water for instant coffee and sat on an overturned chunk of rotted plank near the lean-to entrance while the stove hissed. The wind pushed dead leaves across the roof in soft, scraping bursts. I hung a portable motion sensor near the tree line because I was testing it for guiding season. Not because I was worried, just because I wanted to see how sensitive it was with wind and temperature changes. I had one earbud in and spent maybe an hour listening to old downloaded baseball radio clips while I tightened guy lines and organized my gear. There was a water cooler in the truck with a faded Milwaukee Brewers sticker peeling off the lid. I remember seeing it when I went back for one last armload before full dark and thinking I should have scraped that thing off years ago. The woods stayed unnaturally quiet after sunset, except for one metallic tap far downslope that repeated without changing rhythm. Not louder, not softer, not faster, not slower. Just tap, pause, like somebody hitting metal with a nail or a spoon in the exact same way every time. Even that didn't bother me much. Old stands, loose tags, branches striking something man-made. There are 100 explanations for sounds like that. I drank my coffee, ate half a freeze-dried meal that tasted mostly like warm salt, and got myself settled. I actually slept for a while. Then the motion sensor chirped. It wasn't a loud sound. Just that quick electronic chirp these little devices make when they register movement. My eyes opened, and for a second I had no idea where I was, which always feels worse once you're over 30. Your body wakes up before your brain catches up, and you lie there with your heart already working too hard. I checked my watch, not long before midnight. I unzipped the tent enough to look out. My headlamp threw a weak cone across the clearing. Then I grabbed the flashlight for a better beam. Nothing, no deer, no raccoon, no person. The lean-to sat where it had been, dark and slumped. The tree line beyond it looked ordinary. Then I saw the tape, another strip of orange tied to a branch maybe 10 feet closer than the nearest one I'd noticed while setting up. Waist high this time, not low. Bright enough in the beam that it almost looked wet. It moved a little in the wind. I stared at it longer than I want to admit. Then I actually stood there wondering if pain medication from my knee surgery was making me paranoid. I hadn't taken any that night, to be clear. I mean old medication, the after effects of months of messing with my body, bad sleep. Too much ibuprofen in my life, whatever excuse you want. The point is, I gave myself one. My headlamp had been weak at dusk. I'd been focused on camp setup. I probably just missed it. That's what I told myself, and I believed it enough to zip the tent back up. The motion sensor chirped again maybe 20 minutes later. I looked. Same thing. Nothing moving. Same strip of orange tape. Same quiet woods. Same metallic tap way downslope. Still perfectly spaced, which in hindsight should have bothered me more than it did. By around 2 in the morning, I had seen 3 more markers. They weren't scattered randomly anymore. They formed a rough semicircle facing the mouth of my tent. Not around the whole camp, just the part where I would look if I unzipped the flap. One of them had a notch cut into it like somebody had counted something. I might be mixing up whether the second or third strip had the notch cut into it, because after that point everything sped up. This is where people always ask why I didn't leave right then, and that's fair. The smart move was leaving after the second marker showed up, and I stayed because my pride got involved. I'd been in bad weather, actual injuries, whiteout conditions, panicked missing hikers, all kinds of situations where leaving fast had consequences. Compared to that, a few pieces of tape felt stupid. Juvenile, human if anything. It felt like somebody messing with me, probably another hunter who'd clocked an out-of-town truck and decided to have some fun. Then my water bottle disappeared. I had left it beside the fire ring after topping off from my filter. Metal bottle, dent on one side from a canoe trip years earlier. When I went looking for it, it wasn't there. I checked the obvious spots first because that's what you do. Around the log, under the tarp edge, inside the lean-to. And there it was, standing upright on the lean-to shelf with the cap unscrewed. I actually crouched there and looked at it like maybe I'd done it myself and forgotten. That's how badly your brain wants normal. I told myself raccoons, which even as I thought it, I knew was ridiculous. Raccoons can steal. They can knock things over. They do not carry a bottle under cover and set it upright with the cap loosened like they're making a point. After that, every sound had weight on it. The scrape of leaves, a soft step in wet litter, the faint pat on the tarp overhead. My boot insoles squeaked when I moved, and suddenly that noise seemed loud enough to give me away to something that already knew exactly where I was. At one point, I heard footsteps circling outside the tarp. Not rushing, not stumbling, not animal. Measured. One side of camp, then the back, then the other side, just outside the reach of my flashlight. I held still and listened to the pattern of it. Whoever it was understood the clearing. They understood where I could see and where I couldn't. I nearly packed right then. I had my bag half open, things shoved in sloppy and wrong, and I stopped. Because in my head it was still another person testing me. That's the part I'm not proud of. I didn't want to be run off. I didn't want to limp back to the truck because some local decided to stage a little theater in the dark. I've dealt with drunks, angry landowners, lost hunters who thought I was the threat. I have survived difficult situations before. I know what people sound like when they're trying to scare you because they think they're in charge. I thought this was that. But this was different from that, and I knew it a little before I admitted it. I finally decided I'd had enough and swept the floodlight across the woods. Nothing near camp. I turned downhill toward where the truck was parked off the old fire road farther than you should have been able to see through the trees. The beam caught on something pale, then on metal, then on a shape bent low beside the truck. It was man-shaped. That's the cleanest way I can say it. Crouched beside the driver's side, maybe 50 yards away in a place that should have been mostly blocked by brush and trunk lines. For half a second I thought maybe the light had stitched together branches into a person. Then the shape moved its head. Small movement, enough. I grabbed the pistol, the floodlight, and started downhill before I'd really decided to. My knee hated the angle immediately. Wet leaves sliding under the soles, one hand on brush, beam jerking all over the slope because my breathing had gone wrong. I probably looked ridiculous, this middle-aged guy half limping down a dark hillside trying to act tactical with a camp light and one unlaced boot. By the time I reached the truck, the figure was gone. Both front doors were open. The dome light was on, yellow and weak. And inside the cab there were dozens of narrow strips of orange tape tied neatly across everything. Steering wheel, rearview mirror, seatbelt, gear shift, door handle, headrest posts, the grab bar above the passenger side, even one looped through the turn signal stalk like a little flag. Not tangled, not tossed, tied, deliberate. It looked like somebody had spent time in there. Enough time to sit in my truck and touch each thing I would need to drive away. That was the moment it stopped feeling like harassment and started feeling intimate. Not in any human warm sense, I mean violation. Somebody had been close enough to smell the inside of my cab, to handle the gear I keep arranged a certain way, to decide what got marked and what didn't. The tape on the steering wheel crossed where my hands naturally fall at 10 and 2. The tape on the seatbelt was tied exactly at chest level. Then the motion sensor chirped behind me. Up at the lean-to, not the one by the tree line. The sound came from camp, clear as anything. I turned, floodlight swinging so fast it made me dizzy. From where I stood downhill, I could see the clearing in broken pieces through the trees. No one had passed me. No one had moved uphill while I was on that slope. I know what I could see. I know the lanes between those trunks. I know nobody crossed them. The chirp sounded again. And then I heard it, small and close in the stillness between the metallic taps, the slow zipper sound of the rear pouch on my backpack opening. Not tearing, not fumbling, slowly, like whoever was touching it had all the time in the world. I froze, completely. My legs just stopped working the way legs are supposed to work. Rain wasn't falling, but cold sweat ran down under my shirt and I could taste metal at the back of my throat. My flashlight hand dipped. I remember that specifically, how heavy the light suddenly felt, like it belonged to somebody weaker than me. Every instinct split at once. Go back up. Stay with the truck. Shine the light. Kill the light. Yell. Don't yell. I didn't yell. I backed into the driver's seat with the door still open, ripped tape off the wheel with fingers that barely worked, dropped the pistol into my lap and started the engine on the second try because my hand slipped the first time. The dome light stayed on. I slammed the door, forgot the passenger side was open, reached across, almost fell into the console, got that one shut too. Then I drove. I left gear behind, a lot of it. Stove, some food, one trail camera, the tarp setup, I don't even remember all of it. One boot was unlaced because I'd stepped out of it halfway while packing in a panic and never fixed it. The truck bounced through the ruts and every strip of tape inside shifted in the airflow from the vents, orange flashing at the edge of my sight. I kept expecting somebody to stand up from the back seat even though there wasn't a back seat to stand from. I drove out before sunrise with the dome light still on, and the fine road dust stuck to the sweat around my mouth. At the first place with the signal, I called the sheriff's substation instead of 911 because I was embarrassed by how it sounded even then. Some guy marked my camp, got into my truck, maybe got into my shelter, that's what I said, maybe. Even after all that, I was still softening it. The substation smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner. My hands were shaking enough that I spilled some on the counter when they gave me a paper cup. One deputy looked at the mud on my pants, my unlaced boot, the tape I'd yanked off the steering wheel and brought in with me, and listened without interrupting. Another asked if I'd stumbled onto a dump site or a grow operation or something private. Deputies suggest trespassers or illegal dumpers staged the harassment to protect a hidden site. No physical evidence recovered during daylight search. That was basically the response. Locals sometimes harass outsiders camping near illegal dumping sites. People protect their messes. People protect whatever they're doing out there. It wasn't impossible. Later that afternoon, officers checked the area. In daylight, they found no markers, no footprints, and no sign anyone else had been there recently. No extra camp, no hidden truck, no stash site, nothing obvious. Just my abandoned gear where I'd left some of it and the general worn-out look of a place that had been falling apart long before I showed up. I've tried to live with the rational explanation because it almost works. Territorial harassment by locals makes sense on paper. Somebody wanted me uncomfortable enough to leave. Somebody knew the area better than I did and took advantage of the dark. Fine. People do ugly, patient things for reasons that don't need to be supernatural. What doesn't fit, and this is the part I still circle back to when I can't sleep, is the motion sensor activating inside the lean-to while I was downhill at the truck, and visually confirmed nobody moved past me. If somebody was up there, they were already up there before I ever left camp. And if they were already up there, then every choice I made after midnight happened inside something that had been set up ahead of time for me. I don't camp alone anymore unless I absolutely have to for work. And even then I choose sites with too much exposure instead of too much cover, which would have sounded backward to me once. I store all my camping gear in sealed bins in the garage now, latched and stacked, because one loose strip of orange survey tape hanging from a pack strap is enough to make my stomach turn so hard I have to sit down on the concrete floor. Some stories leave you with a face. Some just leave you with a pattern, and that's worse in its own way. The next one starts with something that looked harmless at the time. The kind of memory you can misfile for years until one detail drags the whole thing back into focus. Story 2. The Shape by the Fence. I was 11 when this happened, so there are parts of that week I only understand now as an adult. At the time, it felt like an adventure, which makes me sound worse than I already do, but I said I was going to tell this honestly. My parents were dealing with a medical emergency out of state. I don't want to get into whose or what kind, mostly because that's their story and not mine, but it happened fast and they couldn't take me with them. So they left me with an older cousin for about a week. He lived in this sagging farmhouse somewhere in the Blue Ridge foothills, nowhere anybody would recognize unless they already knew it. Gravel spur road, weeds up the sides, abandoned cattle fencing running crooked along one part of the property. Tree lines stacked on tree lines so the nearest neighbor might as well have been on another planet. I was a kid from an apartment. To me, the place felt huge, and I hate admitting this, but part of me loved being away from my parents while they were falling apart. I didn't have words for that back then. I just knew the quiet in that house felt different from the quiet at home. At home, quiet meant the fight wasn't happening yet, but it would. In that farmhouse, quiet was just quiet. Boards creaking, refrigerator humming. Insects outside so loud in the evening they blurred every distant sound into one steady wall. My cousin was a decent guy, just stretched thin. He repaired utility lines and worked long shifts, muddy boots and fluorescent safety shirt and hands that always smelled faintly like gasoline because of his gloves and truck and whatever else he'd been handling all day. He'd leave early, come back tired, heat up canned stuff, ask if I was good, and that was about the shape of it. Most afternoons I was alone there. The first day he told me not to wander past the old cattle fence because parts of it had collapsed into sinkholes hidden by weeds. He said it casually, like don't touch the stove, don't mess with the breaker box, same category. I believed him because the fence looked wrong anyway. Posts leaning at odd angles, wire half swallowed in grass, blackberry canes creeping through it. One afternoon I found a baseball in the grass near that fence, just sitting there like it had rolled to a stop and waited. I remember crouching to pick it up and being surprised it was still clean on one side. I assumed other kids must come around there sometimes, even though I never actually saw houses close enough for that to make much sense. Kids assume other kids exist wherever they are. That's probably part of why I didn't say anything about it. Most of those days I sat on the porch steps with a spiral notebook and drew monsters. Bad ones, too. Way too many teeth, way too many claws, all the stuff you think is scary when you're 11. The plastic cushions on the porch chairs were sticky and cracked from sun exposure. If you leaned back wrong, the split seams would sort of grip your skin. I drank warm orange soda out of cans because the fridge never got things all the way cold. I honestly can't remember if the soda was orange or grape that night, but I remember the porch light buzzing. Moths kept hitting the glass over and over. This dry, papery tapping that somehow got louder once it was dark enough for the field beyond the yard to disappear. My cousin would cook inside while I stayed out a little longer. Usually canned stew or something equally sad. Once there was a carton of off-brand cheese crackers left open on the kitchen counter, and they had gone soft from the humidity. And I still ate them anyway because being at somebody else's house turns you into a weird little raccoon. The house itself creaked constantly from the heat settling into warped boards. At sunset, the fireflies drifted above the pasture and the blackberries near the fence gave off this sweet, rotten smell. Overripe and fermenting in the damp air. There was one thing the place did every evening that I noticed but didn't know enough to think about. Around dusk, the birds would stop calling for exactly 1 minute. Not sort of fade out. Stop. All at once. Then, 1 minute later, they started again like somebody had flipped them back on. At 11, I thought that was just a country thing. That's how dumb kids are sometimes. They think every strange pattern is local culture. The first time I saw the figure, it was just standing beyond the fence posts while the light was going down. Too far to make out clearly, but definitely man-shaped. Still enough that it didn't read as a person at first. Just a vertical dark thing where I didn't remember seeing one earlier. I kept looking at it because I couldn't tell if it was closer to the blackberries or the gate or farther uphill. When my cousin came onto the porch, I pointed and asked who that was. He glanced out, barely paused, and said it was probably a scarecrow left by the previous owners that looked different at dusk. That was good enough for me. He was the adult. Adults knew what belonged in a place. If he wasn't worried, why would I be? So the next evening when I saw it again in what looked like a different spot, I just adjusted the story in my head. Different angle, different light. Maybe there were 2 old scarecrows, maybe I just hadn't noticed the fence line well enough the first day. That was basically my whole approach to things then. If an adult had given me a harmless explanation once, I kept reusing it way past the point it made sense. Over several nights, the figure kept appearing in slightly different positions. Once beside the gate. Another time uphill near the blackberry bushes. One evening it seemed farther down the fence line where the ground dropped away a little, and the posts were almost swallowed by weeds. I never saw it move. That part mattered later. At the time, it mostly felt like a puzzle. I even waved once. Nothing happened. I remember feeling embarrassed immediately, even though nobody saw me, just this hot little rush of shame in my face because I knew if it really was a scarecrow, then I'd basically introduced myself to a bundle of dirty clothes on a stick. Even now, part of me wonders if I kept seeing him because I was a lonely kid trying to make shapes into people. I should have told my cousin sooner that I kept seeing somebody by the fence instead of treating it like a game. But here's why I didn't. Nobody around me seemed concerned. My cousin kept living his life. The house kept being a house. He'd come home smelling like gasoline and rainwater and fried food from some truck stop. Toss his utility gloves on the counter and ask if I wanted canned stew or frozen pizza. We'd eat. He'd watch TV half asleep in his chair, and I would go back to my notebook. The figure by the fence stayed in the same part of my brain as the birds going silent. Odd, but apparently normal there. Then one evening, right around the middle of the week, my cousin got home a little earlier than usual and said we were going into town for dinner. I still remember the relief that gave me, though I didn't understand why. It felt like getting a break from something I hadn't admitted was bothering me. We drove out on the gravel road with dust hanging in the headlights and ate at this diner where the menu had laminated corners peeling up. I got pancakes for dinner because that's what kids do when they're suddenly somewhere with choices. Nothing happened in town. That's important. We sat under bright lights with other people around us, and the week shrank back down into something ordinary. I remember thinking the farmhouse would probably seem stupid when we got back, smaller somehow. That's the false part of memory, I guess. You think one normal hour cancels out the strange ones before it. By the time we returned, it was fully dark. The truck headlights swung across the porch, caught the moths at the light, the cracked chairs, the steps where I'd spent every afternoon drawing, and then stopped. There was a man standing directly beside the porch steps. Not out by the fence, not near the blackberry bushes. Right there. One hand resting on the porch railing like he'd been standing there long enough to get comfortable. Tall, filthy work coveralls, dark with grime around the knees and chest. I couldn't see his face well at first because the headlights flattened everything. But I could see he was looking toward the house, not at us. Almost like he hadn't expected us back yet and was thinking about the porch, about the windows, about where I sat every day. My cousin slammed the brakes so hard my seatbelt cut into my neck. The headlights brightened as the truck jolted to a stop, and for one clear second the whole scene sharpened. The man's face was pale under a beard. Not old, not young exactly. Just worn down. His hand stayed on the railing. He didn't flinch. He didn't run. He didn't even look surprised in the way I thought guilty people were supposed to look. I froze because I expected my cousin to explode out of the truck yelling. That's what adults in movies do. That's what I thought would happen. Instead, he hit the lock so hard I heard all 4 doors snap at once and whispered, "Don't get out." That whisper scared me more than if he'd shouted. The man finally turned his head toward us, slowly. Then he stepped off the porch and walked into the tree line beside the house. Not sprinted. Walked. Calmly enough that it felt like we were the interruption, not him. My cousin sat there gripping the wheel. The smell of his gloves and engine heat filled the cab. I could hear the ticking of the cooling metal from some earlier repair equipment in the truck bed and the porch light still buzzing, and under that, after a few seconds, the insects again. I don't remember how long we waited before he used the horn. It felt like forever. Then everything after that moved fast. He backed up, turned the truck around halfway in the yard, nearly slid in the grass, and drove to call the sheriff because the house phone had been out on and off all week. Deputies came out and searched the property. Flashlights through the field, around the shed, under the porch, all that. What they found later was evidence that a transient man had apparently been sleeping in an abandoned tobacco shed uphill from the house. Bedding, canned food, old tools. Signs someone had been there, though not at that exact moment. They said he'd probably been keeping distance from an occupied property until he got bold or desperate. That became the explanation, and I accepted it for years. Deputies dismissed sightings as a drifter keeping distance from occupied property. No charges filed because the man is never located. On paper, that covers almost everything. The figure by the fence, the porch, the fact that he seemed to know when the house would be empty or quiet. It's the kind of answer people can put away in a file and live with. I mostly did. At least until I got older and started replaying that week from outside my own child's perspective. The thing that doesn't fit is the baseball. When the deputies searched the tobacco shed, one of them came out holding a baseball with blue ink initials on it. I remember that because I remember recognizing it before I understood why. Same scuffed side, same initials. Same ball I'd found in the grass by the fence 3 days earlier before anyone believed the man had moved onto the property. Maybe there's a version of this where he had been there longer and nobody knew. That's possible. Maybe he dropped it near the fence and I happened to find it. That's possible too. But when I think about him standing by the porch steps with his hand on the railing where mine had been every afternoon, what gets under my skin isn't just that he was watching. It's how many ordinary moments become ugly once you put him back into them. Me drawing outside, me waving at the fence. Me picking up that baseball like it had just appeared from nowhere. I still can't sit facing an uncovered window at night without checking the reflections behind me every few minutes. Some memories get worse as you age into them. Not because the facts change, but because you finally understand what the facts were doing while you were too young to. The last story isn't about one shape in one place. It's about what happens when somebody knows your routine well enough to make your own habits feel borrowed. Story 3. He knew my route. I do environmental fieldwork for a regional contractor, and every spring I end up somewhere remote counting, measuring, logging, replacing batteries, taking photos, and writing down the same kinds of numbers until they start feeling more trustworthy than people. That probably sounds colder than I mean it to, or maybe it doesn't. The breakup had happened 2 months before this. Long relationship, not dramatic at the end, which somehow made it worse. No screaming, no cheating that I know of, nothing clean you can point at and say, there, that's where it broke. Just the slow realization that I trusted routines more than people because routines don't suddenly decide they're done with you. My work schedule made sense. Rainfall totals made sense. Monitoring intervals made sense. If a sensor failed, there was usually a reason. If a relationship failed, everyone suddenly wanted to talk about complexity. So I threw myself into overtime travel and remote assignments because muddy boots and spreadsheets were easier than being in my apartment with half the books missing from the shelf. That spring, I was documenting salamander populations near runoff channels in a watershed corridor somewhere in the North Carolina Appalachians on protected land I'm still professionally tied to. Narrow corridor, steep ravines on both sides, scattered monitoring stations mounted to trees, accessed through a locked forestry gate, about 3 hours from the nearest field office if traffic behaved. Early spring, constant rain. Paths turning into slick clay channels by noon. The kind of place where your world gets reduced to the next flag, the next station, the next dry place to set a notebook down. I like that kind of work. I always have. You hike in, check runoff sensors after seasonal flooding, log rainfall totals, replace batteries, record stream temperatures, note egg masses, hike out, repeat. Same route daily for a week. Minor variations based on water level. It's solitary, but it's a professional kind of solitary. Structured, measured. You know what you need from the day. The morning it started, I got to the locked gate and found words written in dirt across my truck tailgate. Still using the south path? Not deep scratches, just careful letters traced through the film of mud and pollen on the paint. I can't remember whether the handwriting on the tailgate used a finger or a stick, just that the letters looked careful. Not rushed, not messy. For a few seconds, I just stared at it with my keys in my hand, trying to decide whether I was annoyed or amused. My first assumption was another contractor. That kind of dumb field humor happens all the time. People write things on dusty windows, move each other's cones, swap labels, hide gloves. So I rolled my eyes, wiped it off with a rag from the truck, and kept going. That should have been the first sign that the whole thing was going to get under my skin in a way I couldn't neatly classify. It wasn't just the message, It was that there wasn't supposed to be anybody else with access out there that week without my knowing. Still, I had work to do. I checked the gate log, drove in, parked at the first pull-off, and started the route. Rain tapped rhythmically against my hood. The air had that sour, wet leaf smell that gets trapped under fog after a storm, organic and stale at the same time. Every time I pulled my boots free from the clay, it made that ugly sucking sound like the ground was trying to keep a little piece of me. Mud had already dried into the stitching of my left glove cuff from the day before and made the fabric stiff when I flexed my hand. By mid-morning, I had settled into the usual rhythm. Note station condition. Photograph overflow line. Measure depth. Check culvert. Scan for salamander eggs under flat stones. Record stream temperature in a weatherproof notebook. I've always been the kind of person who feels calmer once the columns start filling up. There were tiny piles of freshly turned stones beside a few monitoring markers, and I noticed them because noticing tiny pattern changes is literally my job. 3 stones here, 4 there, arranged just off the base of the flagged stakes as if somebody had crouched down and fiddled with them overnight. Not random washout, intentional little stacks. I knelt by one and almost laughed because it looked absurdly delicate in all that mud, like whoever did it had wanted me to notice without wanting to say anything. I cataloged salamander eggs at 2 stations, 8 cheap peanut butter crackers that had gotten crushed inside a map tube, and sat beside a culvert listening to a chainsaw somewhere farther down the valley. The sound echoed weirdly, bouncing off the ravine so I couldn't pin the direction. That didn't bother me. A lot of protected land borders active property. You hear work sounds all the time. A truck somewhere, a saw, a dog. The distance gets strange in terrain like that. At the second monitoring site, I found one of my numbered survey flags relocated uphill beside a deer trail I never used. Tied to it was a fresh strip of blue fabric matching my rain jacket color almost exactly. Not similar, matching. I went through possibilities automatically. Another crew borrowed supplies. Somebody found an old strip from prior work. One of my own jacket threads snagged earlier and I never noticed. That last one wasn't likely, but I actually checked the hem anyway. Nothing missing. Instead of leaving, I climbed uphill to investigate because that's what I do. I look for the system. I test the variables. If something is off, I want the mechanism, not the feeling. There was no obvious mechanism, no boot prints clear enough to read, no other tags, just the moved flag and that strip of blue tied tight enough that I had to work at the knot with wet fingers. I bagged it, made a note, and kept moving. That evening in the motel, I told myself it was carelessness from another survey crew. I even emailed a co-worker asking if anybody had been in the watershed recently. He said not this week. I almost mentioned the tailgate message and then didn't because it already sounded smaller in my own head. You get weirdly protective of your credibility in fieldwork. The less office-based your job is, the more you hate sounding rattled by anything vague. Nobody wants to be the person who calls in because of a weird vibe. The next morning, the spiral tightened. I kept some equipment in a locked storage shed inside the gate just for convenience. Batteries, spare markers, a backup data logger, tool roll, that kind of thing. I unlocked it, stepped in, and saw my equipment case had been moved exactly 6 inches to the left on the shelf. I know how stupid that sounds. 6 inches. But I pack and place things the same way every day. Alignment matters when you're tired and wet and trying not to leave expensive equipment behind. The case had been centered under the shelf brace when I left it. Now it wasn't. I stood there with the shed door open looking at that tiny shift and trying not to grant it importance. Then, later that morning, while I was downslope from the creek bend checking a runoff sensor, a man's voice somewhere below me said casual as if we were co-workers on the same crew, "You missed one near the creek bend." I nearly dropped the meter. The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was close enough that the words landed with normal conversational shape, not the stretched sound you get when somebody calls from far away. I turned so fast my hood slapped water into my face. No one. Just wet understory, slick trunks, runoff threading through leaves, and fog hanging low enough to flatten the depth between trees. I called out, asked who was there, identified myself and the company, nothing back, not even brush movement. But the worst part was that he was right. There was an unlogged marker near the creek bend I had noticed earlier and privately decided to catch on the way back. I had not said that aloud. I spent the next 20 minutes searching for another worker, checked the side trail, checked the service cut, climbed a little upslope even though the clay was turning to grease under my boots. Nobody. There's a point where I genuinely wondered whether stress and isolation were making me connect unrelated things. The moved case, the note on the tailgate, the blue fabric, a hidden marker I forgot and somebody happened to mention. Fieldwork can get inside your head if you let every anomaly become a story. At lunch, I found a sketch of my truck parked on a flat, dry rock under the windshield wiper. Not a cartoon, a decent, quick pencil sketch, enough detail to show the dent by the rear bumper and the rack over the bed. Whoever drew it had been close enough to notice the clicking noise one windshield wiper made every fourth pass, because that broken little angle was in the drawing too. The blade caught mid-sweep in a way that made me feel seen more than observed. That's the distinction that started ruining me. Being observed is bad. Being studied is personal. I almost reported everything then. I even took photos, drafted an incident note, and hovered over send on my work phone. But I delayed because I wanted an explanation badly enough to ignore how personal it was getting. I kept investigating because I wanted an explanation badly enough to ignore how personal it was getting. That was my mistake. I told myself I should identify who had access before embarrassing myself with speculation. Maybe another field technician, maybe a contractor from a neighboring tract, maybe someone I actually knew who thought they were being funny. I was doing that thing field people do where we act like note-taking is the same as control. That evening I checked the primitive campsite area near the corridor where I sometimes stayed instead of driving back to the motel. I found boot prints circling the site, not crossing it. Circling. The rain had softened the edges, but the pattern was obvious enough that I stopped counting after the first arc and just stood there listening to my own breathing. Nobody was there. No tent disturbed. No gear missing. Just the print line around the perimeter like somebody had paced while deciding how close to come. I drove back to town that night instead of staying out, which felt like a partial release. Bright gas station, hot coffee, traffic lights, motel ice machine rattling on the second floor. I told myself normal systems still existed. I showered, typed notes, slept badly, and went back in the morning because the contract still had to be completed. And because some ugly, stubborn part of me needed to prove I wasn't being run off my own route. The next day was quieter at first. No note on the truck, no moved case. The stone piles were gone from 2 markers and newly arranged at another. I logged them this time, which felt ridiculous but also necessary. Rain came and went in sheets. By midday, my sleeves were soaked through at the cuffs. I followed my route station by station, investigating every oddity and finding almost nothing concrete each time. A snapped twig here, an impression in the clay there that might have been mine from earlier. A piece of candy wrapper I didn't recognize. The spiral pattern of it was what mattered. Every time I got close to deciding I was overreacting, something nudged me back. Then during the heaviest rain of the week, I saw fresh footprints leading toward the final monitoring station. Not old, not mine. Deep enough at the heel to hold water already. I followed them because of course I did. down a narrow section where the trees pinched the corridor tighter and runoff streamed in ribbons over the clay. The ravines on either side made the sound of rain feel boxed in. My hood narrowed my hearing. My boots kept sucking free with that same obscene mud sound, and every step made me aware of how alone I was out there in a very practical, measurable sense. 3 hours from the office. No one expecting a call until evening. Nobody close enough to hear if I shouted. The footprints led me off the direct path and then back to it in a way that felt intentional, as if whoever made them knew exactly how far I would deviate before deciding something was wrong. I came around a stand of young trees and stopped. Dozens of my survey flags were tied along the trunks ahead of me in exact chronological order matching my hiking route from the entire week. Station 1, then 2, then the creek bend, then the culvert, then the secondary runoff line, every color and number in sequence. Not clustered randomly, ordered, a timeline in flagging tape, my timeline. At the center, hanging from a low branch where the rain had soaked the pages open, was my missing field notebook. I hadn't even realized it was missing yet. I'd assumed it was buried in my pack under the backup batteries and sample bags. The notebook was open to a page in the back where I had written personal shorthand notes to myself during lunch breaks. Not official data, just fragments. Motel reservation extension, call insurance, stop checking her social media, knee brace rubbing. Little ugly human scraps I never expected another person to read. I stood there staring at my own handwriting while rainwater overflowed inside my sleeves and trickled cold down to my elbows. Then a male voice somewhere uphill said my first name, softly. Close enough that it felt placed directly against the back of my neck. Then he said, "You always stop here to check your knee brace." I locked in place. Completely. My brain tried to split into tasks and couldn't. Find the speaker. Grab the notebook. Run. Call for help. Listen. My body chose none of those for a second that felt much longer. Water dripped off the bill of my hood. My hands went numb in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. I could feel my pulse in my teeth. The knee brace thing is what broke whatever professional framework I still had left, because that was private. I adjusted it alone on the steeper section where the trail side-hilled above the ravine. I never logged it, never told coworkers, never made a joke about it over drinks. It was one of those small body maintenance habits people develop after injury and do without thinking, and hearing it spoken back to me felt like hearing someone recite a thought I'd only had internally. I didn't investigate then, not anymore. Understanding arrived at the exact same moment as the need to move. I turned and bolted downslope without collecting a single piece of equipment. Slid half the first stretch on my heels. Caught myself on a sapling hard enough to wrench my shoulder. Lost one glove. Didn't go back for it. The corridor felt wrong in every direction suddenly, like any tree could have a person behind it, and I had used up my last normal explanation. I remember saying out loud to nobody, "Nope," which sounds pathetic now, but that's what came out. Not a smart line, not a brave one, just the verbal shape of leaving. I kept expecting footsteps behind me or another voice, but none came. That made it worse in a way. He didn't need to chase me. He already had what he wanted, which was proof he knew the route better than I knew my own safety inside it. By the time I reached the truck, I was soaked through, shaking hard enough that I fumbled the keys twice. I drove to the ranger office instead of the sheriff because it was closer. Mud across the floor mats, one glove missing, field vest unzipped, face probably blank in that way people get when the body is spending everything on function. The receptionist took one look at me and asked if I was hurt. I said I didn't know. Search teams went out later. By then the rain had intensified. Rangers and co-workers conclude probable stalking by someone familiar with environmental fieldwork. Rain destroys usable evidence and no suspect identified. That was the official shape of it. They recovered scattered survey flags and some of my abandoned equipment. No campsite, no notebook, no second set of prints that could survive the overnight weather. Coworkers suggested another field technician had become fixated on my routine and fled once I contacted authorities. It wasn't impossible. Somebody with access to schedules, routes, methods, even names. Somebody who knew what flagging tape meant, what stations mattered, how to move around without being obvious. I wanted that explanation. I still mostly live inside it because the alternatives are worse and also less useful. Workplace stalking by an unknown contractor or technician familiar with survey schedules and field habits is ugly. But it's real-world ugly. It fits the tailgate message. It fits the moved case. It fits the voice knowing the missed marker. It even fits the notebook if somebody got to my truck or pack when I wasn't paying attention. What it doesn't fit is the knee brace. I had never written that down, never discussed it, never adjusted it anywhere except that one steepening section of trail when I was alone and annoyed and usually muttering at myself under my breath. If somebody saw it once, maybe. But the voice said it like a routine. You always stop here. That's the part that turns the whole memory inside out for me. Not just that someone was there, but that he had watched enough repetitions to build a version of me out there. One more accurate in some ways than the version my friends had in town. I don't take assignments anymore that require repeated routes through isolated corridors. I make excuses if I have to. Rotation needs, scheduling conflict, equipment allocation, whatever sounds normal. In town, I change driving patterns constantly even when I know I'm being irrational. Left instead of right, circle the block once, skip the usual coffee shop. And if the same vehicle appears behind me twice, even for perfectly innocent reasons, I watch the rearview mirror until my eyes start watering and don't stop until it's gone.